The child had never heard of Louis Armstrong. That was exactly why what happened next was possible. By the mid-1950s, the touring life of a musician like Louis Armstrong had become a kind of parallel existence, a world of schedules and distances that ran alongside ordinary American life without quite touching it. The cities came in sequence, a concert hall in one, a hotel in the next, a radio appearance in a third, the whole progression moving according to a calendar assembled months in advance by agents and promoters who had calculated, with reasonable precision, how many nights and how many miles a human being could sustain before the mechanism required a brief pause. Armstrong had been living inside this mechanism for decades. He had played in ballrooms and concert halls and clubs across the United States and Europe, and parts of the world that most Americans of his era had never visited. He had performed for audiences of thousands and for radio listeners numbering in the millions. He had, by the standards available to a black musician in mid-century America, achieved something so uncommon that the industry around him didn't always have clear language for it, a recognition that crossed every boundary the country had thought to divide itself into, that placed his face and his sound in contexts ranging from the most formal concert stages to the humblest neighborhood record stores. What the calendar didn't account for, and what those who traveled with Armstrong during this period described in careful, sometimes quietly moved terms, were the hours in between. The hours between the end of one engagement and the beginning of the next, spent on trains, in the lobbies of hotels, in the back seats of cars moving through states that blurred together after enough days on the road. These were the hours when the mechanism paused and something quieter took its place. Hours that belonged to nobody's schedule, that didn't appear on any advance promotion, that the audiences waiting in the next city had no way of knowing existed. Those who toured with Armstrong consistently noted a quality in him during these in-between hours that was difficult to square with the performer audiences experienced on stage. Not a different personality. The warmth was the same. The humor was the same. The quality of attention he gave to whoever was in the room with him was consistent with everything that made him exceptional in front of a crowd. But there was a quietness to it, a kind of restfulness, as though the hours between performances were not simply gaps in the schedule, but something closer to a different register, one where the music didn't need to be produced, only inhabited. He read during these hours. He wrote correspondence, notes, the journals he kept throughout his adult life with a fidelity that surprised people who knew only his public image. He talked to whoever was around, in the easy, unhurried way of someone with no particular agenda, asking questions about the people he was speaking to with a genuine curiosity that those on the receiving end described, sometimes years later, as one of the things they remembered most clearly about him, that he seemed, even in the brief, accidental conversations of a shared train car or a hotel lobby, actually interested in who you were and where you were going. He also almost always carried his trumpet, not in a way that announced itself, but those who traveled with him said he rarely went far without it, not necessarily to play, but simply as a presence, the way some people carry a book they may not open, or a letter they may not yet be ready to read. The trumpet was part of what he brought with him from one place to the next, as natural a companion as anything else he packed, and about as unremarkable to him as his hat. It was a Tuesday afternoon, somewhere between cities, the specific location varying slightly depending on whose account you follow. What the accounts agree on is the general shape of it, a train station in a small American city, the kind built in an earlier era when trains were still the primary means of covering the country, with high ceilings that held the sound of arrivals and departures longer than necessary, wooden benches worn smooth from decades of use, and a café attached to the waiting area where you could get coffee and something to eat without going outside. Armstrong had time before his train, 40 minutes, perhaps slightly more, enough to sit, enough to rest, not enough to go anywhere that required planning. He took a table in the corner of the café, ordered coffee, and set the trumpet case on the chair beside him. The café held perhaps a dozen people in the particular occupancy of a Tuesday afternoon in a place that most people moved through rather than arrived at. A man reading a newspaper near the window, a woman at the counter with shopping bags, a family at the far end, 2 children, one eating and one who was not. The one who was not eating was watching the trumpet case. The child was perhaps 7 or 8 years old enough to know what a trumpet was, young enough to not yet have accumulated the layers of social hesitation that would, in a few years, make the question forming in their mind feel too large to ask of a stranger. The case was the shape of something specific, something the child had seen in a different context, a parade maybe, or a school concert, and the conclusion arrived naturally. The question that followed arrived with the directness that belongs only to children who have not yet learned to answer their own curiosity before it reaches their mouth. The child came over, stood at a polite distance, and asked if that was a trumpet. Armstrong said it was. The child asked if he played it. Armstrong said he did. A brief pause, the kind that belongs to someone making a genuine calculation. Then the child asked, in the same even tone as everything before it, if he would play something. Armstrong looked at the child. Then he looked around the café, the man with the newspaper, the woman at the counter, the family at the far end. None of them had looked up. The café was doing what cafés do on Tuesday afternoons in places that are not destinations, running its quiet, ordinary business, the clock above the counter moving in the way clocks move when nobody is watching them closely. He had a train in 40 minutes. He had the rest of the tour ahead, the next city, the next hotel, the next concert with its particular expectations, and its several thousand people who had been told in advance exactly what to expect. He had been on the road for 11 days. His hands were tired in the particular way a trumpet player's hands tire after a long stretch, not painful exactly, but conscious of their own use, aware of the work they'd been asked to carry. He looked at the child once more. The child had not moved and had not added anything to the request, had simply asked and was waiting, with the patient, uncomplicated expectancy of someone who had not yet learned that most things people want don't arrive simply by asking. Armstrong opened the case. What happened in the next several minutes was not, by the technical standards of his career, a significant performance. No recording was made. No reviewer was present. The audience was 11 people, one of whom was a child who had asked for exactly this, and the rest of whom had not asked for anything and were present only because Tuesday afternoons sometimes put you in a train station cafe with nowhere particular to be. He began with something quiet, not the large, outward sound that filled halls seating thousands, but something smaller and closer, the kind of playing that happens when there is no back row to reach, no distance to cross between the sound and the person hearing it. The notes moved through the low-ceilinged café the way sound moves through a room built for conversation, not performance. Directly, arriving at each person without the dispersal that large spaces require, close enough that you could hear the breath behind each phrase as clearly as the note itself. The man with the newspaper set it down. He did this without deciding to. The paper simply went to the table the way things go to tables when your hands forget what they were holding. The woman at the counter turned from what she was doing. The family at the far end fell into the particular stillness of people who have stopped what they were doing because something more interesting has started without warning. The child who had asked stood exactly where they had been standing and did not move at all. Armstrong played for perhaps 5 minutes. The music didn't announce itself, didn't arrive with a recognizable opening bar that would have told the room what it was hearing. It moved the way a conversation moves between two people who are genuinely listening to each other, following one phrase into the next with a logic that felt, from the inside of it, less like a performance than like a process, something discovering its own shape as it went. It was, by every account from those present, neither long nor brief. It was exactly as long as it needed to be, and it ended the way those things end, arriving at a place that felt finished without having been planned that way. When he stopped, the café was quiet for a moment in the way spaces go quiet after something unexpected is ended, before anyone has quite decided what the right response is. Then the man near the window began to clap. One clap, tentative, then steadier as it found its own confidence. The woman at the counter joined. The family at the far end. 11 people in a train station cafe applauding a man most of them didn't recognize, for music they hadn't expected and couldn't have named. Armstrong closed the case. He finished his coffee, which had gone cold. He left something on the table and stood, and the child, who had not moved through any of this, looked up at him one more time. Armstrong said something to the child, quiet, brief, the specific words varying across the accounts of those who claimed to have been near enough to hear. The child nodded. Then Armstrong picked up the case and walked toward the platform doors, and the cafe returned, slowly, to being a cafe. No one in the room had known who he was. The man with the newspaper asked the woman at the counter afterward if she knew the name of the man with the trumpet. She didn't. The family at the far end didn't either. The child went back to the table and finished the meal that had been set aside, and whatever conversation had been happening before resumed, slightly slower than before, the way conversations resume after something has briefly interrupted them that cannot quite be explained. Armstrong caught his train. He arrived in the next city on schedule, performed that evening to several thousand people who had purchased tickets in advance, and arrived with clear expectations of what they would hear. The night went as those nights went. He was applauded at length. He moved on. Whether he thought about the cafe that afternoon is not something anyone could say with certainty. He didn't mention it in the accounts that survived from that period. He had, by this point in his career, a long history of these unofficial moments, impromptu sessions in corridors, conversations with strangers on platforms, times he had played for no reason except that someone had asked, or that the moment made a natural case for it. None of them entered his professional record. All of them were, in some way, the same performance. What those moments revealed, taken together, was something that his public career sometimes made difficult to see clearly. That for Armstrong, the music had never been entirely separable from the impulse to play for whoever was present. Not the right audience in the right room with the right advance notice, but simply whoever was there, in whatever room he happened to be in. He had started, after all, playing in the streets of New Orleans, where the audience was whoever was passing, and where the distinction between performing and simply playing had never been especially distinct. A child who had never heard his name asked him to play. That was enough. It had always been enough. The child standing in that cafe had no idea what they were asking for, had no way to know that the man at the corner table had played for presidents and filled concert halls across 3 continents, had asked simply because the case was interesting, and the man seemed like the kind of person who might say yes. That was exactly why what happened next was possible. Not because the music changed when no one knew who was playing it, but because the asking had been pure, uncomplicated by reputation, by history, by the accumulated weight of everything that name carried in every other room Louis Armstrong had ever walked into. For a few minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, in a cafe that most people passed through without stopping, he was simply a man who played when asked. The music went out through the low ceiling of that small room and found 11 people who hadn't expected it. They didn't know what they were hearing. They knew it was something. That, it turned out, was all it had ever needed to be.